Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second show of the year for 2020 and Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be doing part one of two episodes where we focus on production graphics and really some of the things that go into developing graphics for the video space. So, before we jump in here, again, I want to remind everybody that uh, we are welcoming callers to come in if you have anything you'd like to share or join us here. So if you connect to the link here on the screen, we can bring you on and make you part of the show. If you don't want to call in, please add your comments, questions, anything through the chat, and that would be great if we could have you participate that way. So, JS, how are you? Welcome to the show. So, for today's show, as we thought through some of the things that would make sense to cover, what we wanted to focus on initially was what are the different types of graphics. So, if you're coming into a production and somebody's asking you to develop a graphics package for them, what are some of the elements that might be in there that you'd have to worry about? So, I'll start there. Then we'll go a little deeper into some sort of best practices guidelines for developing graphics. And then we'll actually dive into Photoshop and I'll give an overview of how we created some of the graphics we're showing here. But I want to preface this by saying I am not a graphics designer. I've learned things from being around people that do this. So I am very open to learning from all of you. So if you have any additional insights you'd like to share, or if you think I get something wrong, please just jump in. We want to communicate the best information we can here. So probably the first place to start when you talk about graphics is lower thirds. And what you see here on the screen is really the traditional lower third that people are used to seeing. It will be something that will go under a speaker or a presenter, have their name, have a location or a company. There can even be additional information that's available in that. So lots of news organizations will have headline information scrolling across there in some sort of crawl. So, like I said, different ways now that people, are using the traditional lower third. Uh, they're also getting a little more supercharged. So, even though today we're going to be focusing on static graphics, there's a lot more animation making into lower thirds. There's graphics, things like you see this image that we plugged in here that can be added dynamically for different lower thirds that people would be displaying. But lower thirds are really a much broader graphical area than just the simple sort of name identifier. One of the other things, which is probably its most common use case, is in sports. Scores, information, statistics are almost always brought up in this sort of lower third framing across the middle of the screen. And, this gives you even more information than your traditional sort of name title lower third. Brad, hello, how are you? Thanks for joining us. Uh, the the interesting thing about the lower thirds in a lot of sports is that they are dynamic and changing in real time. So this may be plugged into a scoreboard and be pulling information out from that. So in the design, you are also adding this additional technical detail for pulling in the information that goes to populate it. Another area where lower thirds are really critical is social media. Social media is just one additional dimension of engagement. So this can be things you'd have like traditional social media of, anything coming over Twitter or things that are Instagram posts, but it also can be things that are comments. Like on this show, when we put up the comments, that is a social media uh, lower third that gets injected. And again, this is dynamic information. So this is being pulled out from another source and populate it with the information. And in the case of a lot of this with social media lower thirds, you'll have the handle, whatever the media handle they have, their message, photos, and other things that are all baked in. So lower thirds really started out as a very simple way to identify things and have really grown in the video space into a generalized tool for packaging information into the bottom third of the screen that helps people understand or adds to what's going on in the video itself. So there's a lot more though to graphics than just the lower thirds, and probably one of the most common graphics that you may be required to produce is what's used for over the shoulder shots. So that's sort of the traditional thing where you have an announcer on TV or a presenter that's talking, and then you want to put graphics or a presentation or other information into that shot right over their shoulders. So the audience can see that and still get a full view of the presenter. So in doing these types of graphics, you have to be sort of sympathetic to general branding, but these are the types of things which will typically be changed for each show if you're doing something serial. So it'd be something where you'd need to have guidelines for how you want to work with that if you're putting this together as a graphic element and part of a package. So the other thing that comes in is idents. These are sort of station identifiers. Uh, this can be something that a lot of video producers use for branding purposes. It usually would come up somewhere like in the upper part of the screen. A lot of them are automated. They don't necessarily have to have any alpha channel, any transparency. So station idents can be small little colored bugs come on and go off. Uh, but it's really its purpose is more as a branding exercise. The other element that goes with this, though, is a bug, and they're very similar in a lot of ways. But the bug is that little element at the lower part of your screen that typically stays on during a program, and a lot of that has to do with helping to combat piracy. So people, if they take copy the video somehow and replay it, that your branding bug will show up somewhere down there. So this could be specific to the program, specific to the channel, or to a series, and something that brands that as having come from a specific place by a specific provider. So these are fairly simple to make, but they're both something that you see all the time in video that's out both on the web and in broadcast television. So the next thing is something you'll know it when you see it, but it's probably something you don't recognize by name. It's called a mortise. Uh, and now what a mortise is where you take and put a graphic overlay, but with a cutout in it. And in that cutout, you move the video that would have been playing behind that into a more focused position so that you can see the video play while creating some type of added branding, information sets, uh, anything that you may want to use to highlight what's actually being said, but that requires a bigger field of space. This is very often used for upcoming shows, things where you may want to show either sort of retrospective, these are shows you've had in the past, and you sort of keep the big branding, and the show plays a smaller role in the visual space. Or it can be something where this is what's coming on next, and we do this, interstitial between different programs we may be streaming. So if you were at an event and you had another speaker coming on, this could be something where you advertise all the speaker information across the graphic, but then have some small video of the speaker that's coming up, sitting there in the space. Ken, welcome back. I appreciate you joining us here. So, the term, by the way, comes from woodworking, where you have mortise and tenon, a type of joint, where the mortise is the hole that you cut in wood to insert the tenon into to bind them. So it's sort of carried over into here. I'm not sure how that transition happened, but that's really where the terminology comes from. So the other one, which has become a lot more popular recently, is called a snipe. Now, what a snipe is, it's that little thing that sort of animates in the lower part of your screen to advertise something that's coming on, usually next, or if you're watching a series, it could be, something advertising. We're going to have our marathon of the series this weekend, things like that. And the nature of a snipe is that it tends to be something small. It has some dynamic nature to it. Even though this is a static graphic, we spun it in to catch the viewer's eye. But when it's up on the screen, it shouldn't be overly distracting. It's a way to announce itself, give the viewer a chance to look at it, and then it typically sort of just spins away somehow and comes off the screen. And this is again just another advertising, promotional graphic element that you can add. And lots of times people will be requesting this. It's a great way to carry viewers from one program that they're watching into another one that may be coming on later. So it's definitely used for that type of use case. So the other thing is overlays. Now, we all see overlays all the time. I'm live. This is the ratings for the show. Could be other time and date information, things that may be important for production. Uh, but this isn't the only thing. These are sort of standard graphical elements that people would tend to see. But you may also need to do overlays that are part of a production itself. So in this case, this could be something where the producer of this show wants to have a camera overlay that can sit there. So if somebody's watching the show, they know, okay, this is the special house cam we have for our reality TV contestants here. So it provides those sort of signature identifiers. But again, these things are brandable things, and they could be developed in as part of the overall content, graphical content that would get produced for a show you may have. So the other one, I mean, sports is a great place because they've really perfected the art of the graphic. So one of the things that's very common in sports, so you do see it in other places, is what's called a full frame graphic, which is, as the name implies, a graphic that fills the entire frame on the screen. So it's not something that's meant to sort of coexist with video on screen. It's meant to cover the video and then go away. And usually this is for big information panels, something that, like in this case, we have leading scorer in Division 1 football. So this type of thing would allow you to have a voiceover. There could be announcers talking in the background, but still bring on a full screen graphic and then pull that off and go back to the game or sporting event. So very common in sports, but definitely has uses in other areas as well. The other area in sports is what would be called a partial frame. Uh, a partial frame is something that comes on screen and lives with the video behind it, but is designed to sort of be visually compelling, to draw your eye to it and make the video a secondary element in the display. So this is another case where this may be they're announcing everybody, on a team before the game starts. So this could be something where you have each one of the player positions and a photo announcing, the starting lineup for the offense or the defense or, however the sport outlines it. So this gives you another example of a graphic that you may have to develop as part of a graphics package for production. So this is another one that is incredibly common. You're dealing with multi-box effects. It used to be what they called a two box, which really was the limitations of the technology when these things first came on. But now they are true, just multi box. You can have any number of video streams combined with additional graphic elements. So you could have a chart in one of these boxes and people talking about what's in that chart from different perspectives in other boxes on screen. So when you think about multi-boxes, though, there's a few interesting elements to keep in mind. In this case, I set all these up as 16 by 9 elements. But you'll find that most multi-boxes, when they go on screen, are looking more to maximize the horizontal footprint of the video. So they'll crop in the sides, often to sort of a 1-to-1 or just a half screen. So it would be sort of a, an 8 by 16 to 8 by 16 frames, where 8 by 8 frames rather, they're coming in, so sort of square frames that are coming in with some light branding behind them. So you can end up not just having to reposition elements on screen, but now sort of crop them and size them appropriately to fill in a composition with multiple video and graphical elements all together on screen. And again, keep in mind that these present an opportunity for branding. So there may be branded elements that will go into a template that will then get populated for each show. So the other thing, which is more and more important today, for lots of, especially non-broad, it's in news and everything else. But if you're doing live streaming, you'll find that when you work at venues or churches, there's a big need for signage as well. Everything from signage related specifically to what you may be streaming to informational signage, things outside a room that say what event is going on in a particular room. So these types of elements now can be traditional 16 by 9 shape, but they can also be 9 by 16. They can be for wide displays where you have multiple monitors lined up. So when you start to think of signage and graphics, you really are now opening yourself up to a whole new space of graphical dimensions and scope. I mean, now signage, unlike other graphics that will appear on screen, are things that will be seen by a live audience, in large dimension. So the quality of that and the way you compose that has to be sympathetic to the different ways people may be viewing it. Whereas on a news set, those would just be things that are displayed in monitors that are appearing throughout the set and, are more branding and color as well as some information baked into that, but they're more artistic choices as part of dressing the set completely with dynamic elements. So again, another thing to keep in mind. When we look at all of these, I think the most important thing to consider is I've just mentioned these as static graphics. There are other graphical elements that are definitely out there. Things like bumpers and trailers and interstitials where you have some sort of video that plays between different segments of a production. But so all of those things can be part of it. But for today, I really just wanted to focus on uses for static graphics in the production space. So, this is really just an introduction, but I'm sure there are a lot of other situations you'll find that will require graphics and can actually become sort of part of the whole package that you're going to need to develop when building graphics for a production. So now that we've talked about the graphics, I wanted to touch on some considerations you need to have when designing these graphics. Because if you're used to designing graphics in the non video world, uh, some of the best practices there don't translate well into the video space. So the first one is you're going to have to use thicker lines. And it seems sort of counterintuitive in some ways because video displays can be much larger than you would typically have in print, which tends to be sort of like page size, very small. But it's resolution that matters and encoding that matters. So these are two things you'll have to keep in mind. If somebody is doing something 1080, John, thank you for joining us. I appreciate the comment. Uh, if somebody is doing a production in 1080 and they develop graphics around that, resolution, 1 pixel lines will become invisible potentially in 720 and or 640 standard definition. Uh, so you have to think now what type of line size communicates the graphical intent, which is usually sort of segmentation. I'm trying to separate elements on screen. Uh, but that translates well from low resolution devices up to high resolution devices. The other thing to keep in mind is that when video is streamed, it's encoded. And encoding isn't a literal bit for bit transmission. Encoding uses the space around each bit to figure out the best way to compress information. So it usually will have a bit for bit with some sort of luminance, but color information, aliasing information, when lines are not straight horizontal or vertical, but go at some sort of angle. Uh, these are cases where thinner lines don't translate well and can actually become very distracting to viewers. The other thing is really related to this, and that's avoid a lot of subtle detail and busy patterns, especially again where things are very close together and there's these hard transitions between graphical uh, images. So I think if you sort of go back to uh, yes, I mean John is making a point here that there's a lot of people watching on mobile, and while mobile devices have really high physical resolutions, that doesn't necessarily translate to what you would pull from that visually. And to be honest, as some of us get older, then you're holding that phone a little further away. You appreciate things that are a little clearer too. So don't discount the older generation as part of your audience if you're going to be doing some of these designs. But in the early days of video, people would wear different types of clothing which had tight patterns in, like herringbone and other types of more old school clothing patterns. But then when they got on the screen, that would look like it was electric. Things would be moving in and out as it got downsampled to what could stream out on, broadcast television in standard definition with NTSC color encoding. So there are these similar types of issues in the digital space for how things get encoded, the efficiency of the encode, and the delivery, what people are able to watch on the delivery comfortably. Uh, and we've talked about this in the past when we talked about encoding. Things that change gradually encode well. Things that change sharply don't encode well. So you end up potentially degrading the overall image that can get streamed out to people on lower bandwidth connections if there's higher, rapidly changing sharp details in the designs you make. So something to keep in mind. The other piece is keep font sizes readable. And this is typically something over 14 point. I have seen people put videos together where the fonts get minuscule. Like they'll do PowerPoints that are meant for a large auditorium, and they'll go like 3 or 4 indents in, and they get these 7 point fonts sitting there, and nobody can read them. So I think use text as you need it, but if you are going to use it, don't use it the way you would for somebody that would be reading a piece of paper 6 inches to, 2 feet from their face. Do it as something where it's visible from across a room. When you're really trying to do something like an advertiser would do for an ad they're placing at a bus stop or in a train station. I just want somebody to take a look at it, see that, and recognize what it's saying without having to go and sort of poke in and try to figure out what's going on there. Here's another one which I've seen, and I've seen people do it in lower thirds. Always use a background behind text. I've seen people where they'll do like a vertical bar and then have, names or titles beside that. That can look really modern and really cutting edge against the correct background. But, if you have some white elements and there's somebody on set or some prop on set that is white, when you put that up, it the whole separation between the graphic and the video behind it gets completely lost. So one of the things that you need to do for every graphical element you create is understand how to create separation between that element and the things behind it. Because if you don't do that, things become visually muddy. So that's something we'll talk a bit about when we jump into Photoshop and take a look at some of the graphics that we put together for this episode. And sort of going with this is color selection. Uh, for most people, if you're going to be doing graphics, you will start with somebody's brand, whether it's your own or somebody you're doing work for, and that will typically have some general color palette that you need to work with. But you also need to understand all the content that's going around this. So if you're doing something that's for a sporting event and somebody's brand has green in it, you need to make sure that the green that you use to accent their brand and their logo and other things is amply separated from the green in the field that may be part of the pitch that they're playing on behind the image. So these types of things are very, very important. Again, that separation issue. The other thing is understand that colors have to work with other colors. So if you put really garish colors or colors that tend to clash with lots of things in your designs, while there may be something cutting edge about it, it won't necessarily play nicely with a wide range of colors that may be found in the content that could be playing under it. So understand the nature of the content, understand the color space you're going to operate in, and think of ways to create that clear and obvious separation between the elements you're producing graphically and any video that goes behind it. So, and the other thing is understand how aliased edges work with transparency. So, in a lot of these images we showed, there were transparent cutout elements, like in the mortise where it had the curve, or where we had the player where they were posing and you could see, sort of all around the player as a cutout. The way when you use editing tools that edge cutouts work, when you sort of take and I highlight an area and I tell it cut it out, is that it uses the color that's behind, like that's part of this graphic right up to the edge. And when it makes the cut, it aliases that color. So it's sort of taking, if it's white, it'll take white and the color that's in that edge of the image you want to keep and blends them together to create sort of this smooth area, which is the anti-aliased area around the graphic. And that may look good when you have the graphic on its own, but when you place it in front of something that could be a different color, especially a contrasting color, you then sort of see all the aliased dots of the old color poking out there. So the edges look very rough. So when you create these types of cutouts and other things, be very aware of how the anti-aliasing around the aliasing on your edges is actually working, and try it out in front of different backdrops before you turn it over and say this is a good final graphic, because it's definitely something that could come back and bite you and make you look unprofessional when you see it come together. So for you know to wrap this up, I wanted to actually jump into Photoshop and take a look at how we built the full frame image here, and also how we built the partial frame image, which has to deal with transparency. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into Photoshop, and we'll take a look at both of these and hopefully give you some clue to some of the things that go into creating these types of graphics for production. So let me jump here to Photoshop. Okay, so what I have here now is the Photoshop file for the full frame graphic. And if you look over on the side right over here, uh, these are all the layers that go to make this up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start to turn things off so you can see how this was pulled together. So I basically started with a white background and then picked a background image that I thought represented, sort of the sporting venue. If you notice when I picked this image that this isn't sports specific, so it's something to consider if you're going to be doing productions potentially for soccer, for football, for baseball. You may want to do something which is a little more generic. So this doesn't have different types of hash marks or lines or goal outlines or anything like that on it. So it made a good generic background that we could work with. So the next thing that I knew I wanted to put on here was I wanted to put the player image. But when I set this up, even though you have some separation between the foreground and the background, I wanted to find some way in doing this to really make that separation very distinct. And so to do that, what I did here was I put a semi-transparent image here, uh, basically a rectangular image that was white, and then I just made it more transparent. That now creates more of a pop out. This now has a very clear push to the front of the visual space in doing this. And what I then knew I needed to do was I needed to have a place where I could put the name and position. So again, I took the same general type of construct of let's put a rectangle. I made it somewhat slanted to give a little more visual interest and sort of line up where sort of the arm pointing is to go and have that type of continuity in the visual image, and then just having the text that I can put on. So know I needed to have their name and I needed to have their position. Now, when I create this, I put these in here more as stubs or placeholders because I know that the image, the name, the position, and then additionally, any sort of text or something that I wanted to have a call out in this, all of these things are going to have to be replaced dynamically. So effectively, what you end up with is this as your template. Where this is going to be what I will use for all of my players, all of their names and positions, and anything I want to call out special about them. But I did this all, using these elements. So I sort of understand this would be the graphic element of the football players. So I'd have all of these and I could put multiple ones in that I may have. And this would typically be done by having players step in front of a green screen, have some sort of pose they make, take a photo, and then you store that. And in Photoshop, you could go in and cut that out. And again, keeping in mind that you want to have that clean separation when you do the cutout and not have bits of green sort of sitting in there along the edges. So definitely, something that you should, as you do this, you should consider sort of the workflow you want in producing not just the framework for the graphic, but the individual dynamic elements too. One of the hints I will give you on doing these types of images: go really high resolution, work in high resolution up into the point you're ready to size them to use them in the production, because that's going to give you the cleanest edges when you cut things out. And you just have more image to work with. And then when you shrink it, things just get sharper. So as a point of workflow, that's something I would definitely consider doing, for all the images that you're going to produce. And this is something that you can do for a team at any level. I mean, getting a bunch of Rich, how are you? Thanks for joining us. So, you know, you can get a green screen and just use even a cell phone camera and get these kids pictures and put them in and stack them up. So this doesn't need to be a necessary big league production. The sports figure, could they be a dynamic graphic element like you'd see on a lot of the broadcast sports? Absolutely. But again, the same type of rules apply. If you're going to be doing this, use a 4K camera, capture as much detail as you can. Understand that you're going to key it out, so try to capture as much color depth as you can, and then size the final image down to what you need. So again, start in high res and work down as the last step, but do all your work in the most data rich space that you can, before you turn it into, the final graphic elements that you're going to use in the production. So hopefully, this gives you, that first level of understanding. And what we did for this, I'll share a couple of things. When you do graphics that are going to be overlaid on a screen, one of the things that I've found is that you really want some sort of connected continuity with all the elements. So if I had taken what we did in the previous one where I had the picture with the separator, that was fine. But then the name in another location and text in still another location, that is much more difficult for somebody visually to take in as a overlaid graphic with something else going on behind it. So part of the objective in designing the partial frame graphic was to have everything have some sort of continuity, even though they were all separated. So again, this was done with just a blank background. And, as we call these things, take these things away, this was it. So we started here. We knew we needed to add the player. Again, the same type of thing. And now here's where we did something different. So I started out with something that was a vector graphic here in Photoshop. And the advantage to vector graphics is that you can resize them and change them, and they don't lose any sharpness when you do that. So one of the things, vector graphics also have limitations. So you can't use the tools in Photoshop to easily outline them, to cut into them and cut holes in them. So what I ended up doing here was I took and duplicated the layer. So that'd be something you just go over here and say, duplicate this layer. And so that was, pretty straightforward. And then after I duplicated the layer, I went down here and I said, rasterize the layer. So in doing those two things, I ended up with this. And so this rasterized layer, I was now able to do this little cutout over here. And I did this cutout because I wanted to insert this graphic element into it. So uh, again, I rasterized this because at the time I didn't know how else I'd want to work with it. But the other thing is, I didn't want to just make this a sharp cutout where it looked like they were just butted together. I wanted to create this little gap in here. And again, this adds almost a drop shadow effect without any drop shadow. So when you're looking at this, that sort of pushes this out into the same space that you have the player image. And again, leveraging the same. Richard, thanks for joining us. Great to have you here. So this gives you that again, that separation and push to the front of the key elements that you want to highlight in doing the graphic. And now, I was able to do that. And again, let me just sort of go through some of the things that I would do here. In this element here, I would select it. Over here, there is, let me see. Sorry, just give me a second here. Yeah, so I went over here and there's a magic wand tool. So if I go over right to here and do a selection and then select the inverse up here, what I have now is I have this tight frame around here. And I then use the select and said to modify, and then I said expand. So in this, I don't remember the exact, it was probably something like 10 pixels. And so now when I expand that, oh, it was more than that, but it comes out and creates this separation, this gap now between this image and what's next to it. And in doing that, I go back to this rasterized image and I say, now cut out what I highlighted here, which creates this separation. So this gives you, easy tools to do these types of things where you now keep all the continuity that you have in here. And, so these are all connected, but you still create separation, create the push forward. And you have something that, again, when you put, any detailed information into this, these would be the things that would come in dynamically in your production. And this would be your general template that you would use around that. So when I handle things that are going to be semi-transparent in Photoshop, there is just a little opacity slider. So if you can see over here, uh, this slider here lets you take a layer and say, I want to change the background, and say, I can make it almost completely invisible to something that's almost completely solid, and this lets you sort of dial this in. But one of the things I normally do when I sort of get to the point where I think this is good is I have a shot that represents the types of imagery I'm going to put this over. So I can just do something where I'll just go in and say, well, let me just grab a chunk of this here, like the middle, copy it. And then when I go back here in this background now, I can just do edit paste and size it up. So this now gives me a sense of, okay, how does this pop against the colors that this would be behind? Now, the goal here is not to have something which is some sort of perfect resolution image, but because I have this, and especially if I can put this in here, I can now sort of move this around and look at it over different parts of the field or different images. And it gives me a sense of how is the graphic that I'm developing working? Is it standing out? Do I need to come back and say, oh, this really needs to be, a little lighter because it's covering it up. Or I can turn around and say, it's too distracting, so I'm going to make it a little darker here and sort of create more of that separation. But this gives you that final way to tune. And I practice what I preach. The reason this graphic came out so small behind it was this is a very high resolution image right now. So everything I'm working with, prior to this is still, this is probably, almost 5,000 pixels tall by, whatever width, I'm not sure. So definitely a lot higher resolution than I would need for a video production, but something that I will scale down. So hopefully this gives you some sense to some of the tools you have, especially if you're a Photoshop user, and you know gives you some general guidelines for ways to think about producing graphics. I want to re-emphasize that I am not a graphics professional by any stretch. I mean, these are things that I just sort of put together for demonstration purposes. But some of the guidelines that I talked about were things that I have seen both as mistakes people made and solutions people put into practice. So hopefully, in sharing that, that will help some of you. Uh, for our next show, we're going to actually be doing part two of this look at production graphics. This time, taking these graphics that we've produced here and showing you how you would actually integrate them now into a production. How you get the dynamic elements to come in, resize everything, get it to fit, and hopefully sort of take it that next step to put what we created graphically that can now work in video into the actual production workflow and show different ways you can make that work for. And we'll use sports as an example because it's a very common one, but in general, these are rules that could apply anywhere. So uh, thank you all for joining us here for the show today. We will have our after show. So as we, close out here and go dark, uh, we'll come back on and I'll just hang around for as long as you guys want to answer any questions about what we talked about here. But more importantly, just any questions, if it's live streaming, video production related, let's get it out there. I might not be able to answer everything that could come up, but I'm sure in the community, there'll be good answers that will come out from that. So uh, if you can hang around for that, that'd be great. I'll see you in a few. If not, thanks again for joining us, and I will see you next week. Take care. Bye. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the after show. So, yes. So John's asking. Yes, we're gonna be talking about file formats, how to integrate with different data sets, and sort of general best practices for dealing with graphics on scale. Because a lot of these things where you're going to do, you'll be talking about, you'll be talking about more than just the graphical elements, but there's a data management aspect to all of this. I'm not going to be able to go into things like scoreboards or other stuff. We don't really have that here, and I don't have any direct experience with those types of elements. Uh, okay, we're going to be doing another show, at least one other show looking at motion graphics. Those motion graphics actually take more prep time. So, uh, it's something that, we have on the editorial calendar, and we just have to figure out when we have enough time to do all of the elements we'd want to sort of demo in that type of show. But yeah, I mean, it's funny because with the way you can work with static images, you have a lot of transitions on and off and different ways you can move them. Things like comps on the TriCaster, where you can take static things and move them and size them and position them dynamically, at a button push, sort of blend these two together. So you get sort of animation, uh, and you can have different elements that can composite together, but they're still static graphics making them up. So, we will do a show on motion graphics specifically, and hopefully that will, cover some of the things that we didn't get to touch on here. But, you know, all of these things, especially when it comes to some of the design considerations that I highlighted here, I think a lot of those things apply to motion graphics as well. Uh, you where you have some leeway in motion graphics is you can start with fonts that are small but zoom in and other things that may be part of the dynamic nature of it. Uh, you also have different ways to call attention to things. In static graphics, you bring attention to things essentially through color, shape, and layering. Like, how do I take and position things so visually I push things to the front and other things I pull to the back? Uh, because things can move and get closer and further away, or they can play out. You have different ways to call attention to elements in dynamic graphics. So that could be something that could definitely be an interesting adjunct to what we talk about. But one of the things, and these are personal opinions. Uh, I think garish is out. Yeah. uh, the fact you have the ability to have 50 different things moving on your screen doesn't mean it's desirable to have 50 different things moving on your screen. Ultimately, we all come back to it's about the content. It's about what you get to share. And I think the core to that is that graphics, any type, motion, static, whatever, should further the message that you're communicating in your video. It shouldn't be something that sort of competes with it or distracts from it. So in sports, these types of things are very useful because you don't get to see players up close normally outside of sort of reaction shots or whatever when they're on the field. So it gives you a way to understand something about a player or about something that just took place on a field, uh, without pulling you out of the game. And that's the value. Even though these are very sophisticated graphics often that they put together, having that bring you more into the game and what's going on is their real intent. And if you don't achieve that, if you find that you're putting these things up there and pulling people away and they can't really follow what's going on the game, then you're in a position where it's like, all right, I probably shouldn't do that. So it needs to pass that sort of rationale as a test before you say this is a good graphic for what I want. Uh, so yeah, John, is talking about the A10 Mini. Uh, that is one killer little piece of gear. I think that's one of those things where I don't care if you use TriCast or use vMix, use Wirecast, use OBS. Having that in your bag of tricks, that sort of thing you can pull out and say, hey, I can take a couple of different laptops and switch things in, or like you said, John, use it for graphics because they do have the ability to pull graphics in there. So use that to take the output of a system and use that to do different types of overlays. Absolutely. That is a killer little box for like $300. So I think I'd love to get one of those in here and sort of do a review at some point. So I know there's a lot of people that are talking about the things they're doing, and it probably would be a lot of fun to just get to play with that. Uh, the other one that I've looked at in the past, and again, we'll probably get in for a review, is there's a Roland. I forget, it's called the V01 or something like that. I'm not exactly sure the numbers, but it's basically something that has two inputs and you can switch between them, which is great for doing things where you want to like cut between two cameras as a single person production, where you've got one camera set up close to the stage, you're manning a second one, and you just switch between them. So these new mini switchers have a lot of production uses, and I think again are going to be something that all of us are going to have a use case for, uh, and it's not the use case you're planning on. It's the use case the client throws at you when you're sitting in a venue and it's like, oh, and I want to pull this in from over here, or I want to bring this up on a monitor in the front. It's like, okay, I got this. I got a way to handle this. So yeah, those are definitely cool products. So so if there are any other questions, I'll definitely hang around. But I have to say, one of the most enjoyable things in doing this is when I get to talk to some of the folks that really are the true experts at these things, and sort of understand some of the thinking that goes behind their approach to this. And I think that's critical for every aspect of what we do in production. It's really understanding the workflow. John, yeah, if you'd like, I mean, it would be great to have you on if you'd like to show this off. We definitely can do that. We could do it either as an episode where you can sort of give your insights to the ATEM Mini, or if you want to do it as part of the after show. Uh, one of the things with the after show is we can just call on, have somebody call in and present or have a direct conversation. So either way, we're happy to do that. So just reach out to me after the show, and we'll connect and talk about what makes sense. But that'd be great. Love to have you on to do that. Uh, but I think it comes down, when you think about all of these things, is to have doing things with intention. How is this bettering what I'm producing, adding value, adding interest, adding background, anything that can make the overall production better. But the thought process that goes behind all of these people is really around those types of foundational things. The rules they're not mechanical rules. They're really intuitive rules that come around forwarding the narrative, forwarding the arc of what's being presented. And that's impressive anytime you see that, because it shows this innate sense of where you can add value and at what point you stop adding value. And that's always something that's really impressive to me. So, all right. If we don't have any other questions or any other comments here, why don't we call it a wrap for today, so everybody can get a early early Friday break if they want, and go out and grab a coffee if you were carving out another half hour to sit here in the after show. So just take and relax and enjoy yourself. But again, everyone, thanks a lot for hanging out with me here and for being part of this community. This is really great. I get so much satisfaction out of having all of you, share this adventure with me. So until next week, then, I'll see you all. Thanks a lot. Take care.